Hiya, I'm Margot, and it's nice to be with you again, and thank you for being here. Now, you've been listening to some pretty exciting stories recently about Moses, haven't you? And last week you learned something about the plagues which God sent to Pharaoh in Egypt to persuade him to let his people, the Hebrews, free from slavery. Well, today we follow on from that story, and I'd like you to meet Zach. Can you see him? Where are we? There we go, that's Zach. Zach was a Hebrew. He was a Hebrew living in Egypt in slavery. And Zach was puzzled. Actually, he'd been puzzled for some months because so many peculiar things had been happening. Yeah, the Nile had turned to blood, and oh dear, the smell was indescribably awful. And then there were the frogs. Now, as you know, the Hebrew slaves were made to make bricks for the buildings in Egypt, the beautiful buildings that were there, and they had to work very hard. But Zach pondered, it's jolly difficult trying to make bricks when there's frogs everywhere, because every time you stir the mud, a frog pops out of it. And if you try to sit down just to have a moment's break, you find yourself sitting on a frog. It was jolly difficult. But even more puzzling was that where all the Hebrews lived in Goshen, which is a district just outside the city in Egypt where they were building all these bricks, there was nothing. There wasn't a single frog. There wasn't a frog anywhere to be seen. But it was only a couple of miles down the road. How strange was that? And Zach scratched his head and thought again, yes, the gnats. The gnats were quite funny because they bothered the Egyptian slave masters, but they didn't bother the Hebrews at all. So the slave masters were trying to flick away these gnats, and they were trying to swat them, and then they were scratching where the gnats had bitten, and the Hebrews weren't bothered at all. It was quite fun seeing those slave masters in such discomfort. And the darkness, thought Zach, the darkness was really cool. In Egypt, where the building work was going on, you couldn't even see a hand in front of your face. It was so dark. It was too dark to work. And so for 3 days and 3 nights, the Hebrews couldn't work and make the bricks. It was lovely. They had 3 days holiday. And here's the thing. In Goshen, where they lived, it was just ordinary day and night. And yet if you looked across the river to the city in Egypt, it was like looking into a great dark cave. It was very strange. And Zach, well, he had asked his parents, and he understood what they said, that God was using Moses and God was going to set his people free, and he sent these plagues to show Pharaoh who was boss and to make these people go free. But nothing had happened. All that had happened was that the slave masters had got meaner and beat you more often and were very cruel to the Hebrews. Zach was puzzled. He just couldn't understand that God couldn't see that his plan wasn't working. And then, as if that wasn't enough, Zach was puzzled because his parents and all the Hebrews in Goshen seemed to have gone totally crazy. They had loaded whatever possessions they had onto the family cart. There wouldn't be much, it was just a few cooking pots and a chair and the bedrolls. And then their few sheep and goats and cow had been moved into the house. Do you get that? Into the house. And then Furthermore, Dad had gone and killed a lamb, and as if that wasn't strange enough, he'd taken the blood of the lamb and painted it over the doorposts to the house, to the door of the house where they lived. What on earth was going on? Why would Dad paint the doorposts with the blood of a lamb? And everybody in Goshen was doing the same. Every house had the door frame painted with the blood of a lamb. Inside the house, with the sheep and the goats and the cow, Mum was busily roasting that lamb on a fire in the middle of the floor, and she was quickly baking bread without any yeast in it so it would cook much more quickly. What was going on? And then everybody got dressed ready for a journey, so they had their cloaks on and a backpack and their stuff ready to go and their shoes on. You never wore shoes in the house. What was going on? I just didn't understand. And they had to stand and eat the roast meat and the unleavened bread. It was all rush, rush, rush. Zach was puzzled. More than that, he was scared because he could see that everybody else was frightened. Well, he asked his parents what was going on. His dad was very, very serious, and he told Zach that God had told Moses to pass all these instructions on to the Hebrews. They were to kill the lamb, paint the doorposts with blood, eat all of the lamb, and bake unleavened bread, and be ready to go very quickly because they were going on a long journey. That night, Dad said, God was going to send the angel of death to pass throughout the whole of the land, and every household would be visited, and every firstborn human and animal would die, except in those houses whose front door had the doorposts painted with the blood of the lamb. Because this was the night that God was going to set his people free and lead them out of Egypt. Well, Zach was puzzled. God's efforts hadn't worked so far. And not only was Zach puzzled, he was hot and bothered in his outdoor clothes in a little room with nowhere to sit, with the sheep and the goats and the cow, eating and with the embers of the fire that had been used to roast the lamb. He was hot and he was bothered. And not only was he puzzled and hot and bothered, he was frightened. He was frightened because his parents were so serious and warned Zach and worried. And Zach was their firstborn. He was the oldest child. No wonder they were worried. So Zach was puzzled, he was hot, he was bothered, he was scared, but he wasn't hungry. But he ate the meat and bread because he wanted to obey the rules that Moses had set. Moses had said everything had to be eaten, there were to be no leftovers. So Zach had to help to eat that lamb. It was a fairly miserable meal, though. Nobody spoke. Even the cattle seemed too worried to bleat or moo. There was just the sound of breathing, and then of Mum stacking the cooking pots by the door ready to go, and of Dad raking the embers to make sure all the bits of the lamb that couldn't be eaten, the bony bits and the hooves, had been turned to ash, just as Moses had instructed. Then there was a knock at the door. Everybody leapt out of fear. Did the angel of death knock? The knock came again. Very timidly, Zach's dad went to the door and opened it just a crack. And then he opened it wider, looking very surprised, because there on the doorstep was one of the slave masters, and he was offering Dad a basket filled with gold and jewels. Zach just gaped at all these riches. He'd never seen so many in his life. And then he looked at the slave master, and he could see that the slave master had been crying. And the slave master said to Zach's dad, "Please, take these jewels and go." And then he went. Dad closed the door. Just a second later, there was another knock at the door. Dad opened the door, and there stood an Egyptian woman, and she was weeping. And in her arms, she had loads of the finest material. There was finest Egyptian cotton. There was lace so intricately made. There was silk. There was material with jewels all the way through it. And there was material, such richly woven material, and it had gold thread running through it. Zach had never seen such fine material ever before in his life. The woman gave these things to Zach's dad, and she said, just the same as the slave master, "Please, take these and go." Well, the Egyptians had crowded into the streets of Goshen, and they were offering jewellery, gold, coins, materials, blankets, everything you could imagine, and food to everyone, to every Hebrew household. And they were all saying, "Please take these and go." The nearly empty little carts became laden with gifts. It was an amazing sight, and nobody could quite understand what was happening. But they heard from the Egyptians that not one family had not had a death in that family. There had been death everywhere, except in those houses that had the blood of the lamb painted on the door frames to their house. Well, Zach's mum found a little space on her cart to stuff the cooking pots, and then the family left that little house with their sheep and their goats and the cow, and they all filed out onto the streets and gathered at a space where Moses stood. And for a while he spoke to them, and then Moses turned around and led the Hebrews out of Egypt and out of slavery. What an amazing story was that. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.